All right, so we are recording. This is the Service APIs meeting for April 9, 2020. It looks like we've got lots to go through. Thanks to everyone who added things to the agenda. The first thing on the agenda is actually related to an issue Nick had, and I think he is going to be on this call, but because I don't see him yet, I think we might as well move on and come back to it a bit later.
It's a holiday here, but I haven't seen anything from Nick yet today.
Okay, good to know. All right, and I should also mention Bowie has not disappeared. He's just out of office. He should be back next week, and then you'll hear more from him. But anyways, so I guess we can get started here with issue 48, which is Danian's bit to talk about. I don't know, do you want to walk us through this?
Sure. It's an issue that I created pretty early on. And if you take a quick look at it, is Ingress V1. You have the ability to specify what port that you want to forward to on a service, and that did not get ported over to service APIs. And because our forward to, we can forward to, really a non-service object. It's not as simple as solving this as it was in Ingress V1. So this thing's just been kind of like hanging around, languishing, and it's essentially a capability that we had in Ingress V1 we don't have right now, and I think we need to figure out how to solve this problem.
Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, like you mentioned, it's already potentially solvable with service, but since we want this to be more generic than that, you want a generic solution at this level, at potentially at the route level.
So one thing we're doing at VMware, it's a hack for this, and something I'm going to talk about later. This is Andrew Kutz, by the way. Thank you for inviting me for here today. I hope to be a part of this, but we're using the listener's extension object reference to just put a service there to bypass the need for the route entirely, since it doesn't really sort of work well with L4 routes today anyway. And so it can be a long-lived aspect of if you have a controller that reads this, because if the extension is just a service ref, then you can get the ports and everything you need from there. It's not ideal, but.
Right. Do you have any potential solution if it weren't a service ref, like if another object was being
yeah, actually, it's something I'll discuss in my issue.
Okay. Danian, for this issue, had you been hoping that we would add like some kind of target port field on either route or gateway?
Yeah, I was thinking on HTTP route. Yeah, that's one option. Since opening this up, we haven't had a whole lot of discussion around it, so I was just hoping to highlight it again for discussion. And so,
yeah.
Andrew, if when you have a moment, if you can maybe add to this issue with what you described, so we can continue the discussion on the GitHub issue, and ask that others do the same, and because it's something that we need to resolve.
So I'm just updating the issue with this comment, but pretty much every Ingress controller has a way to specify the target port when you want to send traffic to a service. So it seems like one approach we could do here is to just do a quick survey of what existing Ingress controllers do, and if we like any of those options, then we can pull it into a proposal for the spec.
That makes sense. Just for context, what does Contour do?
Contour has some historically Contour has done this with a annotation on the service itself. In recent versions, we also have a port field in our HTTP proxy CRD. So there's actually two ways to do it now. It used to be the annotation, but we found that people using the API would, maybe as a documentation, but we found people would have issues with putting the label on the wrong object. So it seems like it wasn't a very intuitive solution for people. We had to kind of debug quite a few issues where it's like, it's not going there, and we put the label on, but it was on the proxy object, not on the service object. Labeling the service object didn't seem like a natural API for people.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, and it seems like we want to
Annotations
try to
are
avoid
rarely
annotations
intuitive.
at all costs, right?
Maybe it's different in that this is a in-project spec. So, you know, if it's an annotation which is seen as a official Kubernetes extension point, that might be a bit more, you know, that would be more widely known, and people might feel differently about it. And it might have different discoverability probabilities.
So if we add a target port, service port, some kind of property to an HTTP route action, but the forward to object is not a service, then we need to start thinking about how do we handle that use case, right? So, if this port property is optional, and the forward to, I guess I need to think through this a little bit more.
So the problem with this is that the route. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I thought you were.
Yeah, go. No, I'm just kind of thinking out loud. I'm just trying to think. Yeah, this becomes pretty easy if the HTTP route action, the forward to is always a service. But I'm trying to think if we add the destination port as a property to HTTP route action, and the forward to is some other object that's not a service, how do we handle that use case?
So I'm going to suggest it actually shouldn't be an HTTP route at all, and you also start encoding parts of the service spec into your routes that you may or may not want to do. But and again, this is something I'll talk about later. But I could bring it up now, but if you want to loop back to this, but basically my suggestion is going to be that if you take a route that always starts with TCP, I would actually just remove the port from the listener altogether. Like my other PR said, add ports, remove the port, have the route start with a TCP route, then that could have that has your port, that has your ingress and your egress, your forward to, so basically your listener port and your target port, and then that would then also forward to the HTTP route, or maybe even TLS before that, if that makes sense. So you have, because routes forward to other objects, but I don't see any, and it seems to me that and that's part of what the document I linked is, like the implication would be they forward to other routes. So like, don't over encumber the HTTP route. It's part of why I think people are moving away from service, because it's kind of had all this cruft, right? Like, build that into the TCP route, and then have that forward to the HTTP route, and that forward may include a different port.
If I can jump a small comment, in Istio at least we have explicit port pretty much everywhere. So, and we have, if the service destination has a single port, then we assume that it's optional, you don't have to specify it, but if it has multiple ports, you need to put that port explicitly. And the problem is that we have all kind of routing based on port, based on SNI, based on all kind of other stuff. And it gets very confusing if it's not explicit.
No, it's still explicit. It's just, well, never mind.
In your face, I mean, if it's not visible in the API, I mean,
It is.
There is
It is. It's
target port, source port. You kind of need the user to know what it's going on.
It is in the API. It's just not on the HTTP route. It's on the TCP route.
And if we did have a, going back to the simple idea of a target port on a route in general, if that route is then referencing a service, then you have this target port referencing the service port, which then has a separate target port for the endpoint itself. So you have a few steps in between potentially, but yeah.
I mean, so when it does reference a service, and there's always going to be some double encoding of data as long as a service is ever at the end of this, because they inherently are going to have some of the same information, at least at this time. It's like the service ports and endpoints. You could have, and I don't know how people feel about this. I know people have mixed feelings, but the target port could be int or string. And so instead of encoding the numerical value, you say, well, I know it's going to be HTTP, so I'll say it's HTTP, and then I can look that up at the end of this chain. I don't know. I don't need to encode the numerical value because I know somewhere along this route chain, presumably at the termination point, at the leaf, I can look up what the actual numerical value is.
Where are you looking up the numerical value from?
So if something ends in a service, and a service has a service port of HTTP, and it's like 8080, and my TCP route has a target port of HTTP, I had to then follow the forwards to find that value. And it would, the only reason you wouldn't double encode it would be to have that TCP route be more portable, right? To say like, I don't actually know what my target port is. I need to look that up. But that way I can reuse this TCP route depending, for multiple services potentially.
But if that service has multiple ports exposed in the example that you gave, 8080, and it also has 8081 for some foo service or foo port. So how
they can't have the same names though, can they?
Right. I mean, it's two different names, two different ports exposed by the same service, right? That's basically the issue that we're trying to solve here, right?
It's the same case of a service port, the service port and the endpoint port, right? They match based on name. And I'm saying that the target port in the route would have the same name as one of the ports in the service. It's the same model for services and endpoints.
The names are not very commonly used. I mean, most people just use the port number, and we had all kind of problems with the names, matching them in all kind of places.
Well, that's why it's an
It's a tribal option, but yeah. Why do we care too much about the end? I mean, we care about the service port, the primary port of the service, not the target port, because that's.
But the target port, from the route's perspective, is the service port.
Yes, well, yes, but the target port in the service, I mean, there are three levels of indirection, 3 ports that can be involved in that. It's confusing, yes, but again, the main reason is port 80 being privileged and all the other stuff.
So I think that's an argument for making it more explicit, is that there's these levels of indirection which are confusing and tricky, and the terminology is overlapping. So the more explicit, being able to be more explicit makes it easier for people.
Yeah.
Or making it enter string, and then if a controller, if somebody wants to not have to or if somebody wants to dedupe it, then the controller can do that.
One thing I want to mention is in many cases, this whole thing goes to gateways, egress gateways, and multiple proxies, level of proxies. And sometimes it has to be routed by, all kind of metadata. I mean, it's not entirely IP end-to-end. Everyone is source port, destination port. For example, use SNI headers to route in the gateways to do all kind of crazy stuff. So having an explicit construct that allows us to extend it with other routing mechanisms probably will help in many cases.
Here. All about extending the routes, break them apart.
Great. Anything else to add on this while we're here, or should we move on to the next item? Well, I think this will transition pretty naturally anyways, because I believe, Andrew, you're up next. If I can get in here. Yeah.
All right, thanks. So I literally just spent the last, I think, 12 minutes writing this. I've been meaning to write it all day, but something was dumped on my lap last Monday and said, oh, can you have it done by the end of April? So I discovered Services API v2 last Friday, and I quickly had to read all about it. So like I say at the top, I'm not an unbiased observer. I kind of love this. It really meets our needs almost too well. The whole, if you see some of the issues I filed or some of the stuff I've added, some diagrams. I mean, I thought a lot about this, and I mean, y'all been thinking about it a year. I've been thinking about it less than a week. So I can't say I've thought about it nearly as much as y'all, but I've been thinking about it from a very L4 mindset. That's why I called this APIs v2 L4 Boogaloo, because while I've been looking at it, I've kind of realized that it's almost L7 centric to a fault, and it almost discourages anything to do with L4. And in some cases, just out and out prevents it without violating the model that you've defined. So this is not nearly complete. Like I said, I just was jotting this down as a way to organize what I'm trying to say here. This is all kind of based on the two issues I've linked there. But so the first thing, the taxonomy of load balancers, it's become clear to me that there's actually not an agreement on what a load balancer is. I was talking with Nick early my morning, like 2 a.m. this morning, because I know he's not going to be around for a few days, and he didn't think I was online when he sent me an email and offered to chat. I'm like, oh, you're offering while I'm awake. He won't do that again. There's an hour of his life he won't get back. But I mentioned that what I've seen in the Service v2 API very much falls in line with what I call the Eob model, where the load balancer has this IP address and listens on one or more ports. And that was partially informed by that PR where I said, hey, we should add multiple ports to a listener. Well, it should always be 80, right? Because we define the protocol. Well, maybe. And so we started talking about what the expectations there were. I said, well, that's one load balancer, right? And to me, that's what I would call a virtual server. But Eob does call it a load balancer. But then the other type is when you have like NSX or HA proxy model, where the load balancer has one or more virtual servers or front ends. And each of these has an IP address and listens on more than one ports. So when I first looked at the Service v2 API, there was a conflict in the listener.port field. It was clearly a single value, but the documentation indicated more than one port. So that's why I found that PR. But when I looked at that, I'm like, okay, well, the docs are probably right. And to me, the listener was very clear, like you got an address, you got more than one port. That's a virtual server, that's a front end, right? And so a gateway has more than one listener. That makes sense. A gateway is a load balancer and it has more than one front end or virtual server. I get it. But it's become clear that we don't necessarily we haven't reconciled between those two models. And by the way, I probably makes sense to kind of go through the whole thing and loop back with any questions, just because I think it becomes clearer how I think this all relates to L4. If you want to scroll down, I mean, I'm happy to entertain questions along the way. I just think there'll be context that people get as I go through this. It's just pretty short. So importance of control planes. I got into a discussion with James Peach on GitHub last night. We were talking, and I said that I feel like there's a disconnect between gateway and gateway class. Like I really love it. I mean, I really appreciate the simplistic elegance there. But I was just pointing out that I think some clarity is needed because, and I realized where our disconnect was when he and I were talking. When I say control plane, I don't mean the thing. I don't mean the load balancer controller running in Kubernetes. I mean that there are two ways that load balancers are provisioned typically from the cloud and on-prem. In the cloud, or even on-prem, so it's not divided between the two, but there are these two models, right? One model assumes that the control plane used to provision and configure the load balancer will be the same. And I'm talking about things like AWS ELB, NSXT's API, and even Avi's controller VM. So you've got one control plane, one API endpoint that you can say, hey, I need a new load balancer, give that to me. Now, I'm not saying what that load balancer is with respect to the first section, right? Whether that is a thing that can have multiple virtual servers or whether it is a virtual, that's not important. But how I interact, how the gateway class interacts with this thing is, right? So in all these three cases, you've got a single API endpoint, and the gateway class can say, give me a load balancer based on my prescribed configuration. So every time there's a new gateway resource that points to this class, so for example, I'm going to use CIDR as the configuration. I need a load balancer that can give me IP addresses from this range. Great. But the other type is something like HA proxy metal LB, where you don't really have a static control plane for configuring them. You don't even have a control plane until you provision it in the first place. And then the control plane for configuring the load balancer is the load balancer. So if you've got HA proxy running with a data plane API server sidecar and a VM, bare metal, whatever, and you've got 5 of those, each one of those is its own instance, is its own control plane. And so if you've got a single gateway class that says, I want an HA proxy load balancer, that doesn't really work if the gateway class is supposed to map to some static control or some single control plane for configuring load balancers. And there are ways around it. I just kind of want to call people's attention to it, because I'm not even sure what to do about this, but I think it's an important distinction to know. And it affects the way it affects the whole model, because of the way the gateway relates to listeners. And so that was my next thing, promoting listeners. And these are just, again, all ideas. It's not judgment at all. Like, I'm just trying to think, like, how does I reconcile this with L4 or these different models? So I suggested that maybe listeners should be promoted that are on CRD. And the reason for this is it makes it easier to create portable listeners that can be assigned addresses based on what gateway to which the listener belongs. So imagine you're a CPI, a cloud provider interface, and says, I need a load balancer. Maybe the service has an annotation that says, well, this is the load balancer to which it belongs, or if it's not one, create one, or whatever. But it could just create a listener, right? It could just create this listener CRD. And you might have a gateway out here that says, with a listener binding selector, that says, hey, any of these listeners with this annotation belong to me. And the listener resource itself doesn't actually care to what gateway it belongs. And if you switch the selector, then or change it so that some other selector matches, then your load balancer controller will just magically do the right thing, right? And it's great for promoting entire listeners, entire virtual servers, and their routes to from dev to prod, for example. And so routes, what routes? Routes are scoped on gateways. So yeah, maybe not, right? Maybe you promote listeners and demote routes from the gateway into the listener. And the reason for this is because if you do that, then you don't have to define ports on listeners at all. And this is, I think, actually, this is why I end with this. Because it's overly prescriptive in L7, right? And I was thinking, how do I make and I think the best way to demonstrate this is I tried to do an implementation of TCP route because I needed one. And I didn't want to have a private type. So I was like, okay, well, let's put my money where my mouth is, and I want to be involved with this. Let's contribute back, right? And I've been involved with Kubernetes for a while. Cluster API and cloud provider and other things. So not totally brand new, but again, this is very new to this. So the issue with TCP route, if you look at the PR, it works really well when you have TCP plus TLS, because then you can, it very much, by the way, mimics the HTTP route and down to the layout, right? You've got host names, but that doesn't make sense, host names. Well, with TLS, if you've got either whether it's passed through or terminated, you can use the SNI value as the host name, right? But without TLS, you literally have no way from the gateway to match a TCP route to that listener unless you have the listener's name inside the TCP route, which is a total violation of your model, so that it basically selects top down. And it sickened me so much. That's so ugly. I'm not going to support code, and I wrote that code, and I wasn't going to support it. I don't like this. There's got to be a better way. And so, if the listeners have the selector and they don't have ports at all, right? They have the route selector. Then maybe a listener selects 5 TCP routes, and each one of those is different ports: 80, 81, 82, 83, 84, whatever. And then that's where you could define a target port. And instead of having TLS or anything to do with TLS in an HTTP route, right? You have a TLS route, and that's what handles anything to do with TLS. And or there's no TLS, and then that forwards to an HTTP route, and that forwards to the service, right? And so if you break it apart like that and put the route selector on the listener, it's sort of actually, I think, it drives towards that elegance that I think you already do so well for L7. And I just want to enable it for L4. And there's probably a dozen better ways to do it than this, but this was sort of, again, like I'm talking really fast because I had a lot of sleep. This is sort of what I tried to put down on some paper and just kind of distill all of the thoughts swirling in my head. And anyway, that was it. And it's kind of, yeah, I'll stop talking. Thank you for your time.
So can I ask, you're trying to solve the problem of TCP, in particular TCP routing, without
Yes,
any
sir.
other metadata?
Yes, sir.
And because a lot of things nowadays are, I mean, it's more common for users to deal with TLS and HTTP as a common case. I don't know.
I agree, but there's even I didn't know about this issue before I filed the TCP route PR. I filed an issue for a reference sample of TCP route, and then I filed a PR for it. And my issue was XREF'd, I guess, from your meeting yesterday, and I wish I'd have seen this. There was an issue for a bytes stream route, and it has 3 use cases: TLS termination, TLS pass-through, and no TLS. So, I mean, I wasn't the only one thinking of this. Somebody else said, yeah, we need one with no TLS. And that's literally what that PR did. But when you remove TLS, there's no way to map listeners to routes. And by the way, it's because you're relying on something in your L7 payload, your protocol payload with the HTTP header name to map. I mean, you know the concept stock, y'all all wrote it, right? But that is completely absent when you're dealing with raw TCP. You have a port, but I imagine you might have more than one port of port 80 on a load balancer, so you can't just rely on the port.
I can tell you in Istio and Envoy, in general, it's a match, basically, and you have a number of things you can match. One of them is port number. You can also match the IP, and you can match a lot of other things. It boils down to everything every route is a result of matching something.
But if it's at the and that's why I brought up the gateway. Like, what is the scope of a load balancer? Because if the scope of a load balancer means that there should be a single IP address, so like a gateway is a virtual server, not a load balancer like in multiple virtual servers, then that works, right? That works because then you can have routes at the gateway level.
Yeah. But
if the gateway has multiple virtual servers, because it's a load balancer that has multiple virtual servers, that doesn't work at all. And if that's the point, if that's the way it's meant to be, then that needs to be called out. And I don't know that you want to limit it to that, though, because it just doesn't match some other popular load balancer models.
Okay, so I think...
I'm not asking for a resolution today, by the way, just to be clear. Sorry.
So I think that if you go back up from the doc and you look at the taxonomy of load balancers, I think, like, for me, I think that the 2 items you have, they're not really different. It's just a matter of organizational boundaries in these 2 models, right? So ELB is like a load balancer that someone manages, and the NSX-T and HA proxy model is like, well, okay, so I'm the person that manages that. So you can think, one way to think about it is, are there intermediate control planes?
So the control planes issue is separate than the taxonomy of load balancers. I think you might be, I'm conflating them, but the taxonomy of load balancers is specific. Let me see if I can simplify it further, right? Or for my own, because I probably didn't communicate it well. Does a load balancer have a single IP address with multiple ports, or does a load balancer have some subconstruct where the IP address exists and that's where the ports are? Because the routes should be bound to whatever owns the IP. Currently, they're bound to the gateway, and your listeners can have addresses, and that seems in contradiction.
So there is no, as far as I'm aware, there is no requirement for anything called a load balancer to have a single IP. Different infrastructures will, slice this in many different ways. Some providers will use, anycast IPs, which will choose a balancer, and you can think of the terminology load balancer is kind of used at a variety of different levels, right? So the taxonomy of so then this taxonomy, I guess this is, yeah.
No, I agree with you, but I think what you're talking about is a virtual server. If you look at many different load balancers, a front end or a virtual server, I mean, we're using an EIP, in fact, right? And in HA proxy, you would have multiple bind statements with multiple front ends. And each one of those is what you could call that a load balancer, because that front end is going to have back ends. But I could also say that HA proxy itself is the load balancer. So, and I think this is an important distinction, because the routes have to be bound to the front end. And if the front end is the listener, that's another way to say it. Is the front end the listener, or the front end the gateway today? Because the way you've got routes, the front end is the gateway, but you've also got addresses on the listeners, which makes those look like the front end.
Does it matter for a user? Because, sorry, load balancer, yes, there are it's a lot of confusion and the names are not very clear. But from a user point of view, it's very clear. I mean, they want to have a request going to a particular IP that they know and they control, a particular port, like MySQL port. And all they care about is that somehow we make it happen. We make that if the request go to this port and this address, it goes where they want it to go.
I totally agree. I totally agree. It shouldn't matter to the user, but you can't make it happen if the routes are on the gateway and the gateway is subject to multiple IP addresses, because the routes, like a TCP route, shouldn't have to know about the IP address, because the route should be portable and be able to port to many downstream things. Otherwise, the route is specific, and at that point, that piece of information should be moved to the listener, because it's actually part of the listener construct. That's why I said it's prescriptive towards L7, because the L7 payload has the information that you can use to make that decision at runtime.
So just to simplify this, the way I think I'm hearing is, for a TCP route, you want to select the destination of the traffic based on an IP or and a port. Right now, it is only possible to do by port and not an IP.
Well, you may not know the IP of the listener is the other thing, right? The listener may get an IP address that's assigned when the listener gets created, and the TCP route, because routes are bound to the gateway, right? Mm-hmm. With a route binding selector, I already have to have this TCP route out there, or I may already have this TCP route out there.
So the way I see it is, you have two gateways. Let's say you have gateway 1, gateway 2 with different IP addresses. And now
gateways don't have IPs. Listeners do.
So in this model, you have listener and gateways, right? Like in the current model, that's like in the existing model we have a gateway which is associated with a load balancer which has an IP address, okay? And the route is associated with a gateway. So the way one could see possibly is you have one gateway for one IP address, the implementation being a load balancer of some kind. We can keep that on the side for now. So we have gateway 1, gateway 2, and the routes that associate with these gateways implicitly assume that they are receiving traffic from those IP addresses, right?
I would agree with you, except that I'll repeat what I said. A gateway doesn't have an IP address in your model. The listeners do.
Well,
there's no IP address field on a gateway in your model.
Yeah, the gateway listeners do. Right?
Yeah, and that's why I said that those look like virtual servers because of that fact.
So I think the best. Sorry, go ahead.
The gateway does have an IP address eventually. I mean, like just like ingress. I mean, somehow the infrastructure is going to assign an IP address to the gateway and put it in status or somewhere, or maybe multiple IP addresses as needed.
Is that part of the gateway status?
I mean, it should be part of the ingress.
Yeah. So I mean, what Costin and Harry are mentioning when they're saying the gateway does have an IP, I mean, I think we're just getting boggled down into the semantics. I mean, it is a gateway listener IP, right?
But I mean, I'm saying that's the problem though. Like semantics matter when you're trying to understand this, and there's just a bunch of contradictory information. So the gateway status doesn't have an IP. It's got listeners, and listeners look like front ends or virtual servers because of the way everything is written and documented today. If you wanted to make this look like something that is familiar, the gateway itself should have one or more IP addresses, and the listeners should just be ports. Like that would look more like what EOB does. But the way it's currently written, it looks like the gateway represents what I'll call the HA proxy load balancer or the NSX load balancer, and the listeners are virtual servers. And whatever model you choose, I just think it has to be more clear.
Yeah, so we spent a lot of time talking about virtual servers and trying to get the terminology clear, and I think a lot of us went through a similar process that you're experiencing now, Andrew. I think originally, when the original proposal, I think people were thinking of gateway in a way that I think traditionally you see like a virtual server. So I think gateway is probably the closest thing that you can mentally map to a virtual server in the sense of like HTTPD or Nginx.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm looking at the link somebody just posted. I see something here that I haven't seen anywhere else. The virtual host, and I think
I added that. Sorry, I just want to give some background before we get too far.
Yeah, go ahead.
I added this link because of this virtual host concept that we discussed, I guess about a month ago. There was some discussion, I think, around the issue that you're presenting here, and that is how do we support TCP, because currently, we're using layer 7 constructs to be able to have a gateway forward that traffic to the appropriate route, right? And TCP doesn't have those L7 semantics. And it was a brief discussion we had, and what it was around was, what if, since we can't, use these L7 constructs for TCP, what if we were able to take, that request and basically do a lookup on the IP and say, oh, this IP belongs to foo.example.com, and this gateway has a configured domain of example.com. And this is, so we're almost taking that layer 7 information, right? That request that's coming in, and say, oh, this is, this is TCP, performing a TCP binding action, and I need some kind of L7 information. So let me do a DNS lookup for this IP, or a reverse lookup, and say, oh, here's the domain name for this destination IP, and now I could start performing kind of routing selection based on that layer 7 information.
I mean, that's making assumptions that there's so one of the notes in the TCP route that I filed and again removed, I had removed one comment that you had on hostname from HTTP route. You said that it adhered to, I forget which RFC it was, but with the exception that it does not allow IP addresses. I removed that because there may not be an FQD in here. It may only be IP addresses. And so and I didn't know if that was specific, like a requirement for the spec, but I didn't see that anywhere else.
Well, that specific requirement was ported over from Ingress v1.
Got it.
And so to your point, it's okay, how do we solve this problem? And not saying, I'm just throwing out an idea for solving the problem. And so
that's all these are. Was like I said, I thought of it quickly, like what would I do greenfield, but there's got to be some reconcilable approach. And Nick mentioned to me, like, I think he said a lot of y'all were coming from an L7 perspective, and I just thought maybe having a pure L4, a look at this may like twist your head sideways a little bit and say, oh, if we turn it this way, okay, maybe that's something we need to consider. And that's really what all my goal here is, to make sure that it doesn't, not that it does L4 today or tomorrow, but more specifically that it doesn't prevent it from doing it next week, and next week still being, not a real date, but you know what I mean.
Can I make a small comment?
Yeah,
Sorry.
go for it.
There are two issues related to IP addresses. One is that no matter what, we need to reflect the IP, because the user will need to connect to that IP address. So either in status or somewhere, the address that is allocated by the system will need to be reflected. And I think status is the only place where it's one of object. I don't care which one. And a related problem is that the user may have an existing IP from a pool or whatever that they want to specify. Hey, I want this gateway to be assigned to this IP. And that will need to be, again, in listener gateway, somewhere needs to be specified. So one way or another, the IPs will be part of the API. If they're missing, then it's a bug probably. And then they can be matched and they can be used in the API. Does it make sense?
It
or
does.
I'm confused because again,
No, it does. It makes sense. I wonder if a gateway is supposed to be I think, James, you said, like, I think you basically were saying, Andrew, think of a gateway as your virtual server, right? You didn't say those words, but that's what I heard. And if that's the case, then I think it makes sense to have, like, you have a one-to-one relationship on a listener with an address and a port. And I think that has to change, right? Like the addresses should either be on the gateway construct or that's where that one-to-one relationship is, and that's throwing me off. Does that make sense?
So when you specify an address in a listener, that's optional. So some
It's still there, though.
implementations are going to be able to support that, and some are not going to be able to support that, right? So I think it's specified as optional in the comments there, but we probably should make that. I think there's probably work to do in exposing different features that different implementations can support in the API, because clearly, like, clearly that feature is easier for a cloud provider to implement than someone doing on-prem infrastructure.
So I want to ask, if you're doing that to make that possible because people might optionally use it, then just make ports a list. Don't assume just because you've got protocol, ELB doesn't. And then this model can be used for both cases, where gateway represents possible multiple virtual servers, or it is the virtual server, because otherwise there's never a use case where the listener should have an address if it's just a virtual server, because then otherwise you're saying that you have a listener that's going to have an address and a single port, and that doesn't make any sense. So like on 130, if you say, well, if it's protocol of HTTP, you could assume port 81. You can't assume port 80. HTTP can be on any port. But two, like, why can't a listener have multiple ports? You probably wouldn't
believe that we would do. I
through.
think that maybe the idea is that you would just have multiple listeners if you needed multiple ports.
Yeah.
Except that goes back to the gateway being the virtual server, and I would say, well, then why have the address on the listener at all? When does it ever make sense to have a listener with an address and a single port? That makes the gateway look more like the load balancer with multiple virtual servers.
I guess I'm struggling. What is the problem with a gateway having multiple addresses, multiple listeners, each listener with an address and a port?
It's the same. Well, so if you think about it that way, then if you want to have a load balancer that says, I have an IP address of 1234, and I'm listening on ports 80, 81, and 82, right? So you're going to have a gateway with 3 listeners. They're each going to have an address of 1234, and the only difference is One of them's gonna have a port of 80, one's gonna be 81, one's gonna be 82, and that looks really weird and confusing. Like, I mean, because you're basically saying like the gateway can only ever have one IP address, or else why shouldn't the listener have multiple ports? Like you're basically flattening the concept of virtual servers to say, okay, well you can have virtual servers, but if one virtual server has 5 ports, you need to define 5 listeners with the same IP address and those 5 ports, and then 2 listeners will have 2 different IP addresses and a different port. Like that's just a flattened approach to the same model of one listener with an address and multiple ports.
Both variants are a bit confusing. I mean, the service with port is what is typically used. I mean, you connect to IP colon port. It's kind of already flattened in the client and in the user mind. The IP with multiple ports, it's also confusing for many users because the ports are really different services. You don't have same thing on each port.
Well, sure, exactly. And so a virtual server represents a service, and that's what I'm saying. Like, that's what I'm saying. Like right now, it looks like the gateway supports multiple services. If you want to think about it that way, the gateway today appears to support multiple services.
Flattened. I mean, multiple IP port combination where IP can be repeated.
No. I mean, why would you ever want to define if you're saying it's not that, then why would 5 listeners on a single gateway ever have a different address?
Because you have, for example, port MySQL, whatever dedicated port it is, and you have 5 different services listening on that port, and you want to still be able to route. And the only way to route is by allocating different IP addresses.
Okay, so that's your case where you have a service that needs to have different routes. Okay, I'm seeing that where you may want to have MySQL offered on 5 different networks, and so it needs 5 IP addresses, and they all have the same port.
5 instances, 5 tenants, 5 whatever.
Okay.
And because the port needs to be fixed because that's what user asks for.
Yeah, I just don't.
I don't think it's common. I don't think it's very common, but
yeah,
I mean, is there any other answer? I mean, if you have this use case, well, how else can you express it? Because
if you have that use case, how else do you express it? You would have MySQL so in that case, you would have 5 virtual servers. Each virtual server would have their own IP address, and then you would have MySQL on each of those with a port. So an example, but here's I think a better example than what I just said was, if you have 5 virtual servers, and they each have an IP address in a different network, but they need multiple ports because one port is MySQL and then one port is MySQL admin.
So that's also possible.
Not today, because a listener has a single port. You'd have a flattened model. You would need 2 listeners with the same IP address with different ports.
I see. Yeah, it probably should have port as well. Yes, please.
So if you, like I said, if y'all would have approved 130, you probably wouldn't have heard from me. Like, that's what made me start taking a closer look and trying to like reconcile this. I don't know if it was 130. I forget the number.
Just to clarify, and we're running out of time here. So, well,
yeah,
actually,
I'm sorry.
No. Thank you. This has been great discussion. I just one last question. If we did have multiple ports per listener, would we then have multiple protocols?
For me, like I guess it's up to the I'm going to do my magic hand wavy thing and say it's up to the controller. I mean, yeah, I would say that your protocol should probably be specific to your port, and you might want a port construct. Yeah. I know you probably don't like that, but yeah, or just say if you have multiple ports, then you have to assume it's TCP or something like that. I don't know. It still doesn't solve the route issue, and in fact, that's why, like, even without this change, it still doesn't help, because totally I have to just drop the service into the extension, because I don't, you know why? Because of what Daniel was saying earlier. There's no port mapping. I have to go to the service for the port mapping today anyway. So since I have to go there for the port mapping, I may as well just go there for the ports, and it's just going to be, and so I'm just putting that directly into the listener for now.
That makes sense.
So I'm not
What's
sure
the best way
what
to continue this conversation online? Do you want to open an issue, or would comments on this doc be most helpful? Or
You tell me. Like, I did this just to organize my thoughts for this call. I think this is probably not nearly as helpful as individual issues, and maybe what would be helpful to me is if people who know what they're doing here could take a look at this and just add comments, say, hey, I think we should create an issue called this for this, or this isn't an issue. Like, I want to make sure that the issues that get created make sense to be created, and it's not just like one bit. That's why I didn't just file an issue with all of this. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not sure how to express this in a way that's constructive to seeing the change that I want to see, if that change is actually even a good idea. That's why I started here. I didn't want to pollute your issue tracker.
that sounds good.
So-
Yeah, I guess if anyone who's on the call has ideas or ways these could be translated to issues, leave comments or just thoughts in general. This seems like a good starting place. What we've done for other proposals of this scale before is we've started in docs and had a bunch of comments and then transitioned to issues as it made sense. So
And this
hopefully
wasn't meant to be a cap or anything like that, because
Yeah.
I'm not nearly involved in this project to feel comfortable doing something or think that these are necessarily even good ideas. So
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing. There was one issue that we didn't have enough time for with Danian, but I want to at least mention the idea, which I think if we can push this to the next meeting, but just so we're thinking about it and we have come prepared, the question has been proposed if we could, instead of recreating traffic split, use what was in SMI already defined. But I don't want to go too far down that since we're already out of time.
Yeah, we just punt that to next week.
Cool. All right. Well,
I
thanks so
checked with
much,
Nick.
everyone, for
Nick's happy to
coming.
punt his next week too.
Cool. All right. Well, have a great rest of your day.
Thanks.
thanks, Rob. Thanks for listening, everyone.